My name is Annalise. I am 33 years old. I drove 6 hours to a lake house dinner where my father stood up in front of 40 people, raised his glass and toasted his 3 daughters by name. Evadne, Leora, Morwen. I was sitting right there. My glass was already in my hand. My name was not said, not skipped over, not saved for last, just gone. I set my glass down, picked up my keys and walked out. He did not notice until my chair was empty. Before I tell you the rest of this story, I want to know where you are watching from right now. Drop your city or your state in the comments below. And if you have ever sat at a table where someone looked right past you, hit that like button before we go any further, and make sure you subscribe so you do not miss what happens next, because what I did after that night changed everything about how my family sees me, and how I see myself. The lake house sits on the edge of a small private lake in North Dakota. I have known that house since I was a child. My parents bought into it when I was in my late 20s, and it became the place where the family gathered every summer. Bonfires in June, the 4th of July with sparklers and potato salad, and always, a big dinner in late July with the extended family, neighbors, and whoever my parents had decided to invite that year. This particular dinner had 40 people, long tables set up outside, candles running down the center of each table, paper lanterns strung between 2 trees. My mother, Rosalind, had been planning it for 6 weeks. She had called me twice in June to talk about the menu. She had texted me a list of things to bring. I brought all of them. I had driven 6 hours from Fargo that morning. I left at 5:30 a.m. I arrived before either of my sisters. I carried bags in from my car. I helped my mother set up the long tables. I arranged the chairs. I put out the centerpieces. I was not asked to do any of this. I just did it, the way I have been doing things in this family since I was 8 years old. By the time my father, Terence, came out to check on things around noon, the setup was mostly done. He looked at the tables, nodded and said, "Looks good." He did not ask who had done it. He went back inside to watch the game. My sisters arrived in the afternoon. Evadne, 31, came with her boyfriend. Leora, 29, came with her husband and their toddler. Morwen, 25, drove up from Bismarck with a friend. The evening started the way those evenings always started. Loud, warm, familiar, people I had known my whole life, kids running around the lawn. My Aunt Carol pouring wine before anyone asked. I sat at my usual spot, the left side of the main table near the kitchen door. My cousin's husband sat across from me. My Uncle Garrick sat 2 seats down on my left. My glass had been poured. The food was being passed around. I felt for the first part of that evening exactly the way you feel when you are part of something. Present, included, at home. Terence was 64 years old at the time and had always liked a good toast. He had given toasts at graduations, at anniversaries, at the 4th of July dinner 2 summers before when he talked for 11 minutes about American values, and my mother finally coughed loudly enough that he sat down. He was not a shy man. He was the kind of man who felt comfortable at the head of a room. He stood up somewhere around the midpoint of the meal, when most people had finished their first plate and conversations were drifting. He tapped his fork against his glass. The table quieted. The conversations at the smaller tables nearby quieted too, because when Terence stood up, you paid attention. He started talking about the summer, about how good it was to have family together, about the lake house and what it meant to him. His voice was warm. He was smiling. He looked out at the table the way a man looks when he is proud of what he sees. Then he raised his glass. He said to my 3 daughters, Evadne, Leora and Morwen. I had my glass in my hand. My elbow was already lifted. I was already smiling. The name, he said, was Morwen. Not Annalise. Morwen. I looked down at my glass. My elbow came down slowly. I thought for just a second that I had misheard him. I waited to see if he would say something else. I waited to see if he would laugh and say, and of course Annalise, my oldest. I waited to see if anyone at the table would say, Terence, you forgot one. He sat down, people raised their glasses, people drank. My Aunt Carol looked at me from across the table. She looked away. My Uncle Garrick looked down at his plate. My mother lifted her glass and drank. I sat with my glass in my hand for a moment longer than anyone probably noticed. I did not make a sound. I set my glass down on the table with both hands, slowly, the way you set something down when you do not want anyone to hear it. I took the cloth napkin off my lap and placed it on the table next to my plate. I reached to the chair beside me, where I had put my purse and my keys when I sat down. I stood up. I walked through the door into the house. I went to the back bedroom where I had put my overnight bag. I picked it up. I walked through the kitchen, through the front door, and across the gravel to where my car was parked. I got in, I backed out, I drove away. As I passed the side of the house, I could see the tables through the gap in the trees. I could hear laughter. The music had started again. The dinner was continuing. Nobody had stopped. Nobody had come after me. My father did not notice that my chair was empty until 15 minutes later, when someone pointed it out to him. I know this because Garrick told me the next day. I stopped once, at a gas station somewhere in the middle of the drive. I went inside, bought a cup of coffee, and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. I did not cry during those 20 minutes. I was not in shock. I was not confused. I was something quieter than that. I was sitting with the recognition of something I had already known for a long time, something that had been true for years, and that had now been said out loud, in front of 40 people without anyone blinking. My father had 4 daughters, he named 3 of them, and not one person at that table said a word. I finished my coffee. I got back on the road. I drove the rest of the way home to Fargo in the dark. I want to tell you something about how I grew up, because none of what happened at that dinner came from nowhere. I am the oldest of 4 children. When Evadne was born, I was 4 years old. When Leora came along, I was 6. When Morwen was born, I was 8, and Morwen came into the world 6 weeks early and spent the first 3 months of her life in the neonatal intensive care unit at the hospital in Bismarck. I want to say clearly that I understood, even as a child, that a sick baby needed attention. I am not telling this story to say that my parents were wrong to focus on Morwen during those months. What I am telling you is what happened to me during the same time, and what never quite went back to normal after. My mother spent most of that first year at the hospital. My father ran his small trucking company out of an office in Bismarck and worked long hours. They were both stretched thin in ways that I could see even at 8 years old. So I made breakfast, I packed my own lunch and Evadne's, I got us both to the bus stop on time. I helped Evadne with her homework in the evenings. I went to bed without being told. I woke up without being asked. Nobody taught me to do those things. I just looked around at what needed doing and I did it. As we got older, the shape of our family became clear in ways that I could not have named as a child, but understood completely by the time I was a teenager. Evadne played soccer from the time she was 7. Terence drove her to every single game, not most of them, every one. He bought her new cleats every fall. He built a shelf in the living room specifically for her trophies and her medals. When Evadne scored the winning goal in the regional championship her junior year of high school, Terence called everyone in the family to tell them about it. I know this because I was in my dorm room in Grand Forks when he called me to describe the goal in detail. He did not call me when I got the Academic Achievement Award that same semester. I did not tell him about it. Leora started piano at 7. My mother drove her to lessons every Tuesday and every Thursday for 11 years without missing a session. My parents attended every recital Leora ever performed in. I sat in the back row at those recitals, the one member of the family without a dedicated seat. Morwen continued to have health issues through her childhood and into her teenage years. Nothing catastrophic after the early days, but enough to require regular doctor visits, periods of bed rest, and the kind of sustained parental attention that the situation genuinely called for. I did not and do not resent Morwen for her health. I resent the fact that the rest of the family seemed to use Morwen's needs as the reason no one ever had to notice mine. Junior year of high school, I was selected for the advanced academic program at my school. It was invitation only. Fewer than 20 students across the entire grade were admitted. When the letter came, I showed it to my mother at dinner. She said, "That is nice, Annalise," and then asked Evadne what she wanted for her upcoming birthday. Senior year, I applied for a full academic scholarship to the University of North Dakota entirely on my own. I researched the requirements, wrote the essay drafts, revised them, submitted the application, and waited. When the acceptance letter arrived, I opened it at the kitchen table alone. I told my mother that evening. She said, "Oh, you got in, good." She was on the phone when she said it. The scholarship covered 80% of my tuition for 4 years. No one in my family ever mentioned that scholarship again. May 10 years ago. I graduated from the University of North Dakota with a degree in marketing and a grade point average of 3.8. I had been on the dean's list every semester. I had held a part-time job for 3 of my 4 years there to cover my living expenses. I told my parents the date of the graduation ceremony 3 months in advance. The morning of the ceremony, Terence called me at 7 a.m. He said there was a business meeting with a logistics partner from Minnesota that he could not reschedule. He said the meeting had been set for weeks. He said he was sorry and that he knew I understood. I said yes, I understood. I said it was fine. I hung up the phone. My mother came. She arrived 20 minutes after the ceremony began and missed the moment when my name was called. She found me on the lawn afterward and took photos. On the 2-hour drive back to Bismarck, she mentioned that Morwen had been having stomach pains the day before and that Terence had taken her to the doctor that morning before the meeting. I looked out the window for the rest of the drive and did not say much. After graduation, I stayed in Grand Forks for 2 years, working for a small communications firm. Then I moved to Fargo, farther from home, enough space to breathe. Over the next several years, I built a career in digital marketing. I was disciplined, consistent, and good at what I did. By the time of the lake house dinner, I was a digital marketing manager at a software company in Fargo, responsible for a team and a budget that would have surprised my family if they had ever thought to ask what I actually did at work. They did not ask. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Fargo with my roommate Delia, who had been my friend since our early 20s. I had a routine. I had a savings account. I had a life that I had built entirely without anyone in my family's help, attention, or interest. That was the person who drove 6 hours to the lake house dinner. That was the person who set the tables, arranged the chairs, sat down with her glass already poured, and listened to her father name 3 daughters out of 4. I turned my phone off when I got home at 2 in the morning. When I turned it back on the next day, I had 11 missed calls, 3 from Terence, 5 from my mother, 2 from Evadne, 1 from Leora, nothing from Morwen. There were 9 text messages spread across 3 days. I read all of them without responding to any of them right away. I want to tell you exactly what they said, because the specific words people choose in moments like this matter. My mother's first message, sent the night of the dinner: "Where did you go? Why did you leave like that?" Terence's first message: "You have me worried, call me back." Evadne's message: "Everyone is asking where you went, kind of awkward." My mother's second message the morning after: "Your father just misspoke, you do not need to do this." My mother's third message the following day: "You have always been the most sensitive one in this family. He did not mean anything by it." Terence's second message: "I do not understand why you reacted this way, can we talk?" Evadne's second message: "Come on, he just made a mistake." Leora's message: "Are you okay?" My mother's fourth message on the third day: "Your father is really upset, please call him." I read each message once. I did not respond to any of them that day. 4 days after the dinner, an envelope arrived in the mail. My mother's handwriting on the front. I recognized it immediately. I opened it at my kitchen table. It was 1 page, front and back, written in blue ink. There was no apology in the letter, not a direct one. Rosalind wrote that Terence had been distracted by concerns about his business. She wrote that the dinner had been a success up until the point that you chose to leave. She wrote that I had always been the most self-sufficient of the 4 girls, and that this was something she and Terence had always been proud of, and that they had given me space over the years because they knew I could handle things on my own. The last 2 sentences read: "You have always been the most sensitive one in this family. Your father has never meant you any harm." I read the letter through to the end. I folded it along its original creases and put it in a small cardboard box on the shelf in my bedroom closet, where I keep important documents. Not because the letter was important in the way a deed or a contract is important, because I knew there would come a day when I would need to remember exactly what was written, and I did not trust my memory to be precise enough. Of everyone who had been sitting at that table, there was only one person I wanted to talk to. Not because he had done something to help in the moment, but because I had watched him look down at his plate, and I knew that meant he had heard what I heard. Garrick was my mother's older brother. He was 60 years old, lived in Minot, and had been a quiet presence in my life since I was a child. He was not a man who said a great deal, which made it matter more when he did. I called him on the evening of the 4th day after the dinner. The call lasted 45 minutes. He did not hedge, he said, "You are not imagining anything, I was sitting right there, I heard it clearly, and I knew you heard it." He told me that he had wanted to say something at the table and had not known what to say, and he apologized for that. It was the first apology I received from anyone in my family. It was the only one. He said something else that I have thought about many times since then. He said, "Your father is not a bad man, but there are people who do not see what is right in front of them, and that is not something you caused, and it is not something you can fix." I wrote that down after I hung up. After talking to Garrick, I decided that I was not going to call Terence. Not because I hated him, not because I had written him off, but because I had no clarity yet about what I wanted a conversation with him to accomplish, and I was not willing to have a conversation just to make everyone else more comfortable. I sent my mother one text message: "I received your letter, I need more time." Rosalind did not respond to that message for 4 days. When she did, her response was, "Take the time you need, we love you." I read that and put my phone down. About a week after the letter arrived, I sat down with my laptop and a spreadsheet. This is how I process things that are too large to think about in the abstract. I put them into a document where I can see them clearly. I looked back 3 years. I listed every time I had sent money to my family. There were 5 separate instances. The first was in March of the previous year. Terence called me on a Tuesday night at 10:40 p.m. One of his company's trucks had a blown engine. He needed $2,000 by the next morning to get it into the shop before losing a contracted run. I transferred the money at 7 the next morning. There was no paperwork, no discussion of repayment terms. The second was the following July. My mother texted to say a pipe had burst in the house, and the repair estimate was $1,800. I sent $2,000 to leave a little extra. I did not ask for a receipt. The third was in November of that same year. Morwen needed a minor medical procedure. Her insurance covered most of it but not the full amount. The remaining balance was $2,500. I paid it. The fourth was the following February. Terence said he needed a deposit on a new trucking contract and asked if I could cover $1,500 until the contract paid out. I sent it. The fifth was in May of the year of the lake house dinner. My mother called 3 times in 1 week to say they needed to repaint the exterior of the house before winter, that the contractor had quoted $2,000, and that they were short. I sent $2,000. Total over 3 years, $10,000. Every one of those calls or messages came at night. Every one was described as urgent. Not one of them was followed by a repayment or a written acknowledgement. 3 weeks after the lake house dinner, my mother texted to say that the family was planning a dinner for Evadne's 30th birthday at a restaurant in Bismarck. The private dining room rental and the set menu cost $3,000 total. She asked how much I wanted to contribute. I sat with that message for about an hour. Then I typed back, "I am not going to join this time, I will send flowers to Evadne." I ordered a bouquet of $100, wrote a short card by hand, and had it delivered to Evadne's address. The card said, "Happy birthday, I hope 30 is a really good year for you." My mother texted me that same afternoon, "You are not coming to your sister's birthday, people are going to ask where you are." I did not answer that message. 2 days later she sent another one. "Because you did not contribute, your father and I had to use our savings to cover your portion. Your father is stressed about this." I read that message twice. I thought about the $10,000. I thought about the fact that in 3 years not one message from my mother had ever mentioned repayment. Not one call from Terence had ever included the words, "We will pay you back." And now, the first time I said no to something, I was being told that my absence was costing my father money from his savings. I wrote back one sentence: "Mom, I have sent $10,000 to the family over the past 3 years. I hope everyone is doing okay." She did not reply to that message. That evening I told Delia the full story, not just the dinner. Everything, the money, the letter, the texts, all of it. Delia worked in personal finance. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have all of this written down somewhere?" I told her about the spreadsheet. She said, "Good, keep it." Then she said, "You know that none of this was ever required of you, right? No one can call you at 10 at night and expect a bank transfer by morning. That is not how family works. That is not how anything works." I had known this in a general way for a long time, but hearing it said plainly, by someone sitting across the table from me with a cup of tea in her hand, was different. I said, "I know." She said, "Then you can stop." 2 months after the dinner, I received an email from the family's property attorney. It was a routine matter related to some updated documentation for the lake house. He needed a signature from each co-owner. I stopped reading when I saw that word, co-owner. I had known, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I had invested money in the lake house. What I had not done was sit down and think clearly about what that investment meant legally. I pulled out my files. In the spring of the year I was 28, Terence had called me and explained that the family had an opportunity to buy back the lake house property from a relative on my mother's side. The price was favourable. He asked if I wanted to join the investment as a co-owner. I had some money saved from several years of working and living carefully. I said yes. I transferred $97,000. The paperwork was signed. I became a 1/3 owner of the lake house. What had not happened in the 5 years since then? Any discussion of how the ownership would work. Any share of the rental income from the weeks the lake house was rented to other families. Any conversation about what would happen to my stake if I ever wanted to leave. The rental income from those weeks went into a joint account held by Terence and Rosalind. My name was not on that account. I made an appointment with a property and family asset attorney in Fargo named Marcus Holt. I brought the original purchase documents, the deed, and the co-ownership agreement. Marcus reviewed everything and confirmed what the email had already told me. I was a 1/3 owner of the lake house. My ownership was legally documented. The original purchase price in the year of the transaction was just under $300,000 total. My $97,000 contribution had covered my 1/3 share at that price. Marcus then requested a current market appraisal. The appraisal came back at $400,000. My 1/3 share at current value was $145,000. Marcus sent a formal notice to the family stating that I intended to liquidate my ownership stake. Terence called me the day after the notice arrived. It was the first time he had called since the series of missed calls after the dinner. He said, "Annalise, this is a family property. You cannot just sell your piece of it." I said, "Terence, I contributed $97,000 to this property 5 years ago. I am a documented co-owner. I have the legal right to liquidate my stake." He said, "This is not about legal rights. This is about family." I said, "I understand. You will hear from my attorney." My mother called an hour after Terence. She said I was tearing the family apart. I let her finish what she was saying. Then I said, "Mom, I am going to handle this through Marcus. He will be in touch." I hung up the phone and sent Marcus a note to proceed. Aunt Carol, Terence's younger sister, reached out to Marcus within a week of receiving the formal notice. She said she did not want the lake house to leave the family and asked whether she could purchase my share directly rather than having it go to an outside buyer. She had the funds available. She was willing to pay the appraised value. The transaction took 6 weeks to complete. I signed the final documents at Marcus's office on a Thursday afternoon in November. The amount of $145,000 was deposited into my bank account. I thanked Marcus, shook his hand, and drove home. Not one member of my immediate family contacted me on that day. 3 days after the sale closed, Rosalind sent me an email, not a text. A full email several paragraphs long. She wrote that I had betrayed the memory of my grandmother Vera, who had lived at the lake house during the last years of her life. She wrote that the property had meaning beyond its dollar value, and that what I had done showed that I did not understand what family legacy meant. She wrote that she hoped I would one day regret my decision. I read the email once. I left it in my inbox for 3 days. On the 4th day I wrote back. My response was 2 sentences. "I have a great deal of respect for Grandma Vera's memory. I also have the right to make decisions about my own assets. Those 2 things are not in conflict." Rosalind did not reply. I did not make any immediate large purchases. I did not take a vacation right away. I made an appointment with a financial advisor named Priya, who worked at a firm in Fargo. We met twice before I made any decisions. In the end, I put $40,000 into a high-yield savings account as an emergency fund. I moved $50,000 into a long-term investment account. I set aside $55,000 for a home purchase within the next 2 years. For the first time in my adult life, I had money that no one else had any claim to. Not legally, not emotionally, not through a late-night phone call. It was mine. I had earned the original $97,000 through years of careful work, and now it had grown into something I could build a real future with. I sat with that for a while, It was a quieter feeling than I expected, more solid than joyful. I was not celebrating. I was just standing on ground that belonged to me. A year after the lake house dinner, my life looked like this. I was still in Fargo. I was still digital marketing manager at the same software company, but I had just been promoted. 2 additional team members now reported directly to me. My salary had increased by 14%. I was meeting with a real estate agent to look at houses in a neighborhood on the west side of Fargo where the streets had sidewalks and the lots were large enough for a garden. I did not cut off my family completely, but the shape of my relationship with them changed. I stopped being available for late-night financial calls. I stopped explaining my decisions. I stopped waiting for recognition that was not coming. About 4 months after the dinner, Evadne texted me to say she had started a new job. It was a straightforward message, no reference to anything that had happened. I sent her a small flower arrangement and a card. She thanked me with a short text. We did not talk about the dinner. We did not talk about the birthday party. What I understood in the months that followed is that my relationship with each of my sisters did not have to be the same as my relationship with my parents. I could acknowledge Evadne's good news without returning to a version of myself that gave without limit. Those were separate things. Garrick and I began having dinner together once a month. Sometimes he drove down from Minot to Fargo. Sometimes I drove up. We chose small restaurants, the kind of places where you can hear the person across the table from you. He told me things about our family's history that I had never heard before, not as analysis or judgment, just as stories. He remembered details that no one else in the family ever mentioned. He was the first person in my family who knew that I had been studying Spanish on weekends. He was the first person in my family who knew I wanted to grow vegetables. He asked about my job and listened to the answers. That was what it felt like to be seen by someone who was paying attention. My close friend Willa had a daughter named Marin who was 8 years old. I had known Willa since college. On weekend afternoons when Willa had things to take care of, Marin sometimes came to my apartment. I liked having her around. It was not something anyone asked me to do. It was just something that happened and then kept happening because it was easy and good. One Saturday afternoon we were making a batch of cookies together. We had mixed everything, shaped them, put them in the oven and set the timer. When the timer went off, I opened the oven and found that the cookies had spread flat. The temperature had been wrong. They were more like thin discs than actual cookies. I looked at the pan for a moment. Marin looked at the pan. Then she looked up at me and said in a completely matter-of-fact voice, "Whether there are cookies or no cookies, we can still eat." I stood in my kitchen holding an oven mitt and looked at this 8-year-old for a long moment. Then I laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. She was right, we ate the flat cookies anyway, they were still good. My father has not apologized. Not in a letter, not in a phone call, not in a text. I do not believe this is because he is deliberately cruel. I believe it is because he does not experience what happened the way I experienced it. In his version of that night, he misspoke. In my version, he named 3 daughters in front of 40 people and sat down. Both of those things are true at the same time. I have not blocked his number. I have not told him he cannot contact me. If he calls, I decide in the moment whether I am in a place to answer. Sometimes I am. Sometimes I am not. The decision belongs to me and I make it without guilt. What I no longer do is wait. I no longer keep a version of myself available on standby in case someone in my family finally turns around and notices me standing there. That version of me waited for 33 years. She is not waiting anymore. Being forgotten is not the same as being gone. I was at that table. I had driven 6 hours to be there. I had set up the chairs and laid out the centerpieces and poured water into the pitchers before any of the guests arrived. I was sitting in my seat with my glass raised when my father stood up to speak. He did not say my name. I set my glass down and I left. I did not disappear. I drove home. I turned my phone off. I made coffee in my own kitchen the next morning. I talked to Garrick. I sat with a spreadsheet and looked at what 3 years of quiet generosity had actually cost me. I hired a lawyer. I signed papers. I deposited $145,000. I sat across from Marin while she ate a flat cookie and told me something that an 8-year-old should not have been wise enough to say but was. There are things about my family that will not change. I have accepted that. My father sees 3 daughters when he looks at his children. My mother sees my self-sufficiency as evidence that I do not need to be looked at. Those beliefs are built into the structure of how they think, and I am not the person who can dismantle them. but I am the person who can decide what I do with that information. I can decide where I put my money, my time, my presence, and my attention. I can decide which table I sit at and which ones I walk away from. I walked away from one table on a July night in North Dakota. And I have not once wished I had stayed. If you have ever been the person in your family who was simply expected to show up, carry the weight, and be grateful for not being noticed, I want you to know that you are allowed to set your glass down. You are allowed to pick up your keys. You are allowed to drive away. You do not have to wait for someone else to say your name to know that you exist. I want to ask you something before you go. Has there ever been a moment in your family where you were invisible, where something important about you was overlooked, and you had to decide whether to speak up or stay quiet? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it. A friend who has been holding on too long. A sister who is always the one who shows up and never gets thanked. Someone who has been driving 6 hours and setting up chairs and waiting for their name to be called. And if you have not already, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more stories coming, and every one of them is about what happens when a woman finally decides that enough is enough. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself this week. And remember, being forgotten is not the same as being gone.